Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsey, a psychologist in Silicon Valley and the host of Super Psyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. Super Psyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't.
I'm a big fan of the English language, and although I make a lot of errors with grammar, I'm always trying to learn the rules. Yet, as you'll hear on this episode, a word or phrase might be grammatically incorrect, but linguistically correct. And I cringe as I write this. That includes the most dreaded of non-word words, irregardless. Groan. At least my spell check caught this so-called word with a red underline. And I was utterly thrilled to talk about language with Dr. Valerie Fridland, a professor of linguistics at University of Nevada, Reno, and the author of a hilarious and highly educational book called, like literally, dude, Arguing for the Good in Bad English. So listen in as Valerie gives a mini masterclass on the language we use. Dr. Valerie Fridland, a hearty welcome to Super Psyched.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
I couldn't have taken more interest in your book. I am one of those people for whom words like irregardless or between you and I, there's so many things in the vernacular that cause my ears to just get a little bit hurt like nails on a chalkboard. And your book really ameliorated that for me in many ways. So I'm just grateful to you for having put out this hilariously titled, like literally, dude, book. It's so much fun.
Well, I titled it by the nails on the chalkboard for most people, right? Like literally and dude seem to irritate a lot of people. I hear about it in my career all the time when I give talks or from my students. So I thought I'd pick the top things that people find irritating and explain the beautiful history and purpose behind them. Because I think we sometimes undervalue the changes that happen in our language instead of looking at why they happen and how they actually help us.
Couldn't agree more. And what's so funny is if it's California surfer, Valley girl, I'm fine with it. It must have something to do with me being very regional and being okay with the way my group, like the terms like literally, dude, are things that I would say. Irregardless, I would not. I would not say between you, and I wouldn't do that. I generally try to end my sentences without a preposition. But like literally, dude, unfortunately, I do fall in the category of that. So there's this weird sense of like what is acceptable to me and what is not. And I'm guessing it's just based upon where I'm from.
It has to do with where you're from, what age you are, the social group you tend to inhabit and spend time with. The reason like literally, dude, hit the note for my book title is because people notice it primarily because it's become so prevalent. So a lot of us hear it in our own speech. A lot of us dislike it in our own speech. So we use it and it's obviously doing something for us, but we think, oh, I heard there's another like. We're very sensitive about that. So I also am a like user. I have been known, my husband will say that I have been known to use literally, non-literally. My son is a big dude user. So sometimes I use it with him. So all of these things are in my speech as well. But what I noticed when I would talk to people is they would often feel very self-aware of using it and feel like somehow they were saying something wrong. Now, I think the ones that you're talking about between you and I and irregardless, one of the reasons that those seem different to you is because like it literally are changes in the way we're using language, but they're not non-standard in the sense of here's a grammar book that says don't use them. Although in the case of like, actually, you can find grammar books that say that when you use them as a conjunction. But irregardless is something that people claim is not a word, which is not true because if you're using it as a word, it's a word. May not be a word you like, but it's a word. And between you and I, it's because it is not the right case. And grammatically speaking, from a grammar book perspective, that is prescriptively incorrect. So I think what you're kind of tuning into is a difference between prescriptive norms and things that violate prescriptive norms, like not ending a sentence with a preposition, and regional or age-based changes, which are things like and literally. So there is a little bit of a difference. And I think that's what you're tuning into there.
So interesting. And I've always really liked language. And I remember reading E.B. White's
Elements of style. Yes, that's a classic.
I loved it. I'm reading it on a Japanese subway, as geeky as that sounds, because I'm a newly minted English teacher. And I want to make sure I'm on point. And I loved it. And it's so interesting. The way that you think has just changed my brain. I'd never really considered that there would be a difference between the way grammar sees things and a linguist sees things. And that was one of the big takeaways. There were many big takeaways from your book. But the idea that grammatically correct is not necessarily perhaps linguistically correct. Can you explain the differences?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, I would say that often what we think as prescriptively grammatically correct is rarely linguistically correct, meaning very few things we do violate rules of our brain or rules of our mouths, which is really what linguistics is about. Why do brains work the way they do? How do they produce speech in the way that they do? And how do they explain the way that language changes over time? But prescriptive grammar, these ideas like don't end a sentence with a preposition, don't split an infinitive, those kinds of things, use objective case versus subjective case after prepositions, those kinds of things. Those were really just made up grammar rules that came to us in the 18th century as the rise of prescription entered English. So English was really only a colloquial language. It was only a vernacular. It wasn't a elite classic written language really up to that point. What happened was it started to get more value as a literary language, as a language of education and law, a language of religion around the 16th and 17th centuries. Prior to that, English had no value. It was just a street language. It was the way that we loved people. It was the way that we had time with our children. It was the way that we did trades on the street, but it wasn't the way that we did our religious services or wrote our laws or governed. That had been Latin and French. So it was the language on the street, and you could say what you wanted. No one was judging you. But then around the 18th century, as English became the law and the religion and the educational norm, it also was a time when the Industrial Revolution was happening. So a lot of the lower class who were speaking a different form of English than the upper class started to rise in power and influence. And when that happens, people get nervous, right? The people in the upper crust position start to feel they're being taken over. Well, one of the last ways to tell people apart at this time was not in clothes. It wasn't where you lived, because now the rising middle class had the money to buy all those things. Those are purchasable. You could even buy a title, right? You could be a lord, even if you weren't born to it. But what you couldn't buy is language. You couldn't buy an accent. And so that was really a discerning marker between the upper crust and the lower classes in the 18th century. So this spawned a lot of desire among those who were from the lower classes that were now middle class to talk like those in the upper class, to sort of pass, right? To become the well-regarded of society, because as long as they kept their accent, they would always be lesser. And that inspired upper class people to think, I can make a buck here. Let's write a grammar book. Let's write a usage manual. Let me do elocution guides. Let me make little pamphlets to sell for a penny a piece and make some money teaching people to lose these features that mark them as low class. And that's really when the rise of prescription happened, when upper class speakers started to use their speech as a model for lower class speakers to attain that kind of structure. And the really interesting thing is that those models were not based on English as an inherent grammar, like looking at English and what's the grammar of English I want to teach these people. It was actually based on models of Latin, because Latin was considered a grammared language. English was considered a grammarless language, meaning it was just a colloquial language that didn't have much value. And Latin was the model on which we should all structure our thinking. And therefore, not ending a sentence with a preposition, not splitting infinitives were actually rules based on Latin grammar that got imported to English where they actually weren't relevant. So the reason those are rules of Latin is because in Latin, you can't split infinitives. They're one word. They're two in English. They're one word in Latin, so you wouldn't split them. And in Latin, you don't end sentences with prepositions. And so in Romance languages, you don't. But in English, which is a Germanic language, it's fine. So this was a weird importation of Latin grammar on English language. And therefore, these rules are actually odd and not even correct in the sense of explaining what English speakers actually do.
I'm taking great pleasure in listening to you share this, hearing that the origins of English were more rugby than, say, badminton, so to speak, and that it provided latitude for different types of conversations to transpire. And this is something I observed when I was an English teacher in Japan. I was working with very well-trained Japanese primarily men metallurgists. But when they spoke in English, they informed me both by their actions and speech, as well as literally saying to me, I can say things in English I have never been able to say before.
Oh, that's interesting. So sort of the language released them, the formality versus informality. Well, there are a lot of different norms in Japanese culture than in English. So that really probably has more to do with feeling like they're not bound by the cultural constraints of Japanese culture when speaking English, which is the same in India. A lot of times why there's a really big growth in English in India, why it became a freeing language is because it helps people get out of the caste system. It helps people get out of the beliefs people carry with these stereotypes and ideologies about the variations in speech that they have. When you speak English, you're released from those because the cultural differences and ideologies that are brought up by that language are different. So I think it's a lovely freeing notion. But yes, I would say in the Old English period, there were certainly feudal lords. The word lord is actually from Fridland back in the Old English period, which would be the sort of the people that were the head of the clan or the tribe. And they were, I mean, not kings and lords like we think of them today, but they certainly had power and they spoke English. So there was a time in Old English when English did have some power in different areas, but it was still not the language of written form. First of all, people weren't literate, but if they were going to write, if you were a scribe, you were probably writing in Latin or reading Latin. And so it has a long history of being a language that is free to change to meet the needs of the speakers at any given moment. And we still have that in English today, which is why it changes so drastically between one generation and the next.
Unbelievable. So interesting. And one of the other great sources of pleasure is that you explain the historical precedents of so many things that we think and say. I'm going to go a-riding. I'm going to go of writing. Is that correct?
On writing.
On writing, sorry. You got the preposition?
It depended on and of, sometimes alternated. So it would have been an un or an of, but it probably would have been, I would be on writing or on hunting.
And one of the things that you describe also is how language can connect us and how it can disconnect us. For example, one of your most hilarious pieces comes towards the end of the book, and you're describing how a woman had crushed her interviews for a faculty position, and she corrected someone on their pronunciation of Budapest. And I'm thinking there's so many no-nos. It's almost like a Larry David phenomenon where you can be right, but you don't get the goods for being right.
Yeah, that was a really fun. I mean, that's a true story too. We were interviewing for a professorship, and professors are interesting people as it stands, and often they think they're always right. So I think it was a little combination of that. But that was an interview process. We learned a lot. One was we had a bunch of people coming in for interviews, and one showed up in a crop top, and I thought maybe not the fashion choice I would have made, but to each their own. And then another one had made it past the initial cuts, and we brought them to campus, and we were at a reception after all the interviews. Things seemed to be going well. And yes, she corrected another professor on her pronunciation. And I just saw that professor's face go, never, you will never get in the door at this place. It was just such a bad choice, but she was right if you think of right as being what's accurate to the native pronunciation, but she was not right in that moment.
1,000,000%. And I'm thinking about the Larry David component of, you can be right and you can really, really incur scorched earth unwittingly by being right. It's one of the big tenets of couples therapy from where I sit. Let's go into how to best connect with our children who speak a different vernacular, seem to be coming up with neologisms, which are fake words, and yet they are words that they are using perhaps to our ears in a manner that is cacophonous, but one where it's kind of you can't beat them, join them. And I would prefer to join than to beat. In this case, I have my kids in the house for a short period of time. I want to pick my battles, and I also want to connect maximally. I also, of course, want to teach them. I might even want to say, hey, I will use these words all day. I just want you to know that, I don't know, just what are your tips to parents?
I have kids. I have teenagers. Actually, my son is 18 now, so he's not even a teenager anymore. And I think it changes through their lifespan. And it's also dependent on your relationship with them. I've had actually a lovely long-running conversation with a grandmother who read my book and reached out to me over email to ask me that exact question. How do I connect with my grandkids? I feel like they're so different than me. What can I do? And I think you have to decide based on the type of relationship you have and the age of your kids, how much you're going to inquire about their language as an interested party and how much you're going to try to imitate their language, because it can sometimes come across badly. If you try to adopt their speech, it's almost mocking sometimes, and they take it that way. Or my daughter, if I ever try to pick up and use one of her slang terms, she's 16, does the roll her eyes bit and is like, please don't ever say that again. So that may not be for a 16-year-old the right approach. But when my son was younger, he duded a lot. He was a big dude speaker. I mean, from like 3rd grade to 5th or 6th grade, dude. It was dude for everything. It was dude meaning, notice this, mom. It was dude meaning, that doesn't make me happy, mom. It was, hey, dude, to his friends. There were all sorts of dudes he used. And so I would use dude with him in that way. At his age, he loved it. He'd come home and I'd say, dude, how was your day? And it became a little thing we did together. And then he kind of went away. He doesn't dude me at all anymore. He'll still dude his friends, but not me. And so now I've learned to step back. I don't say dude to him that much. So I think it kind of changes with the time. Young children really love that engagement with their language. And you can ask them, hey, how was your day, dude? And they'll like it. But if I say that to my 16-year-old, it doesn't go over as well. If I walk around and say, God, that's so bougie. My daughter's like, ew, mom, don't ever let that leave your mouth again. So what I'll do instead is my daughter's on a team and we travel for volleyball a lot. So sometimes I'll give rides to her friends and I'll listen to them in the back seat saying things. So they'll be like slay and lit and bougie and all this stuff. It comes out, all the new terms. And so instead of trying to adopt it, I'll be like, hey, I've never heard that before. What does that mean? Can you tell me how you use it? I ask them questions about it. Now, sometimes my daughter still rolls her eyes, but her friends love it. They love her mom, the investigator. And in fact, we were even at a pottery plating place one time with a bunch of her friends. I was asking them questions because every year I go to a New Word of the Year contest event. That's a big event nationally.
How interesting that would be.
Oh, it's so fun. So I always try to ask my students and my kids, well, tell me new words and what do they mean? And what do you think should win? We were having that conversation. And even the young woman behind the desk came over and she's like, oh, I wrote down some words for you. So I think interest is probably the best thing you can show your kids. And not necessarily try to use that slang. You have to kind of read your kids, see if that's appropriate. But ask about it, be interested in it, and don't worry about it. Unless they're, cursing and that really bothers you. Most of the words that they're picking up, if they say slay 50 times a day, which my daughter does, for example, that will die down as they get older. They're not going to be adults that slay everything. They're only going to be adolescents that do that. So you are not going to really influence their speech as much as their peer group at this time. And by you saying don't use that, all you do is make it more exciting. So my advice would be show interest, but not concern.
I love that. And the reason you heard my nonverbal when you said dude is kind of a comma for me. If I had a dude counter following me everywhere I went, I have no idea how many dudes I say throughout the day. As you just described them, as well as in that Super Bowl commercial where dude was used in a multitude of contexts, I use dude all the time. I love it. I'm from California. I grew up that way. It makes me feel like me, frankly. I can't imagine losing dude. That would be a really hard one to get rid of. You have a whole discourse on dude throughout the book, including its origins, which is so surprising. But folks, you have to read it. But let's just say, stuck a feather in his hat and called it macaroni. You may have heard of this guy. I think his name was Yankee Doodle. You will find out more about dude and how American of a term it is in certain ways.
Great teaser. Dude actually ages you. I've noticed my son was a dude speaker and he still dudes, but my students and my daughter are bruh. Now it's bruh. Bruh is the new dude now. So they still say dude, but more they say it when they're annoyed. Dude is really a mark of annoyance now. And bruh is the new dude. And they also use that. My daughter bruhs me all the time when she's annoyed at me. She's like, bruh, I didn't say that. So it's all changing, but it's still is that same purpose. And it's a really interesting thing that it's also another term for man, right? It's also a male term, which has become kind of unisex and universal.
Yeah. I've heard my son, who's also 18, talk to his female friends and start with dude, and bruh is omnipresent. You also described that there are regional terms. I grew up in California and we always wanted to emulate the cool Southern California sounds, the Jeff Spicolis of the world. And surfer lingo was really, really popular. You also mentioned that the word hella, which we use up here in Northern California, is less used or maybe not used in Southern California, which flummoxed me because Gwen Stefani, who is definitely a SoCal woman, one of her big hits is hella good. So it's just very funny how regions do things. Let's get into regions though for a second. I remember feeling crestfallen as I drove Highway 80 all the way across the country, seeing Applebee after Applebee restaurant, but not seeing local regional things. And that seems to be mimicked by regional vernacular that is used.
Regional dialects.
Dialects, yeah. And I love hearing a voice and saying, wow, you just pronounced the chemical equivalent of H2O in a way that only someone from Philly would use. And they say, yeah,
woulda,
Philly.
woulda.
I love that one.
I got some woulda. Yes,
woulda.
I love the woulda.
I love that one. And I can hear somebody from Minnesota and be like, oh yeah, it's easily Minnesota or Wisconsin. And I love the Southern twangs. I love it all. I love the difference between Brooklyn and Jersey, which is very, 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 very hard to hear, but I kind of can. I think, or maybe I'm delusional, but I feel like I can. I love that stuff. I don't want it to go away. And yet you even create the thought experiment, like what if Tower of Babel was true? What if we all spoke English? What would we lose? What do we lose when we lose regional accents? What do we lose when we lose access to the various languages that have various words that we would not be able to use in English? Like natsukashi in Japanese means a type of nostalgia, but there's just so much more nuanced. I can feel it in my body as much as an American can. It's different than nostalgia. So what do we lose when we lose regional accents? What do we lose when we lose languages and everyone's conforming?
I think it's a very similar process to ecological diversity. When we lose plants and animals, right, we are losing the richness of the tapestry of what our world is. But not only that, we're losing function. We're losing different ways of existing. And so when we get rid of a species, there's something left, there's a void left there. And it could be a void by how that contributed to the food chain. It could be a void by how its excrement actually, fertilized the plants that then grew in that area that are now dying, right? So things are connected. And I think that's what we don't understand about language. When you look at biological diversity and linguistic diversity, they're very, very closely related. And in fact, many, many studies have traced linguistic and biological diversity together. And so they're not separate things. They are part of the same beast. And part of the problem is when we get rid of the smaller languages, which are the ones that tend to be more complex, because over time languages get bigger, they lose complexity. English is not a very complex language compared to what it used to be and compared to smaller indigenous languages that have much more, and this is a big word, morphosyntactic complexity, which means the way they code things in the language is much more structured and intricate. So we are getting rid of smaller indigenous languages and smaller regional dialects at the expense of those dialects to get these larger superstructure languages. And while, yes, there can be some benefits in the fact that if I'm an English speaker and then I can read everything in English, it's great. Or I can go anywhere and speak in English, it's great for me. But what it's not great for is preserving history, preserving biological, genetic dispositions that have been realized in language in different ways across different species. So the ways that languages have evolved. We lose that. We lose different ways of understanding how people's brains work because language reflects structures of the brains that have been operational in different ways. And that's a fancy way to say that different ways of thinking produce different ways of speaking. And that's not meaning that people have different brains. That means that people use those brains in different ways to create language. And when we start to get more uniform and we start to lose the ability to see the options that existed, which is what happens when we get rid of these small indigenous languages, then we start to think that brains only work one way rather than understand how flexible they might have been. We also don't understand our origins very well because then we don't have more data to provide insight into, well, how might this have formed? A lot of the language studies that are historical in nature are trying to figure out the origin story of language. Well, how did biological and linguistic diversity first happen? Was it in one single source or was it many, many sources? Did it grow in multiple places at multiple times, or was it a monogenetic theory where it only happened once? Well, when we lose the diversity of species and languages, we are less able to answer that question. So there are lots of reasons, both historical and in our present day abilities to see the world in different ways and describe different parts of it and pay attention to different things about it, that we lose when we lose linguistic diversity.
You've described a mosaic of great complexity that is gorgeous with hues and colors. And with the extinguishing of a language, we lose that hue and that color. And one of my great takeaways from talking with Temple Grandin, who is on the autism spectrum and has been a great contributor to the science around autism and a host of other things, including more humane practices of creating beef, which is a nicer way of saying killing cows. Euphemism alert. But where I'm going, and I am a beef eater, I love it. But so I don't want to sound, I always feel very hypocritical and a little bit of cognitive dissonance. So it must mean I'm a good person. So at least I feel bad about it. But where I'm going with this is one of the things that would happen with various types of diversity, whether it's racial, linguistic, sexual identification, whatever it might be, we tend to do better when we have a team that's kind of like Lord of the Rings, for lack of a better. We have someone with a hammer, someone with a bow and arrow, someone with magic, and someone who knows how to be a kick-ass warrior. We need different types of people on a team. And Temple Grandin said, if I had been on the Space Shuttle Columbia team that was creating that, I would have spotted the defect. There would have been no explosion. I have a visual strength that kind of goes on the opposite end of the pendulum for what I don't have. Someone like me was needed for this team. And one of the things that I also take great pleasure in is when you learn a foreign language, and one of the reasons I'm so hopeful my kids will speak something foreign is you get to have a different part of your self-expression. If I'm drinking sangria in Spain, laughing my ass off with a bunch of people in Spanish, or hanging out in Mexico with a group of Mexican people, I get to have a different version of Adam contextually, and it will not occur when I'm hanging out in my own milieu.
Well, you don't get out of the grooves that you've worn for yourself. And that I think is really the crux of why it is a loss to all of us when we lose diversity in languages or in dialects. Just think you're talking about the word in Japanese that is sort of the word for nostalgia, but you can't quite capture it. Do you remember when you learned that word, you were like, yes, or you got this emotion because it captured something that you could almost touch. This idea you've never thought of before all of a sudden becomes real to you. And that's what the beauty of diversity in languages does. It allows us to look at the world differently because we've been given a language to do it in. And, just the things that language pays attention to. You were talking about how it's a mosaic and some of the color is lost when you lose different languages. Well, actually, some of the color is lost because, for example, the way we divide up the color spectrum depends on how you talk about it. That's right. So some languages don't have pink because they only have red and white. English speakers, because they have the word pink, have learned to look for pink. So language allows you to see things differently because of the tools it gives you. And when we start to get rid of those tools, we can't do the mechanics that's required with it. So there are a lot of reasons. But I think to get back to your point about regional dialects, it is true if you look at overall studies of the regions in the United States and elsewhere that we are losing regional dialect diversity in big picture. So young speakers in the South, especially in urban areas, sound a lot more like young speakers in the North now. There's very little difference. Part of that is because of in-migration. There is a huge influx of non-Southerners in major urban areas of the South. And whenever you have that, you start to get dialect mixing. And this is something that we've had. I mean, the West was settled by a bunch of people from different dialects, and it kind of homogenizes things a little bit. Another is because also young people are connected in a way they weren't before. So when I grew up in the South, and I had non-Southern parents, which is why I don't have a Southern accent, because the people that we hung out with tended to be also non-Southerners with non-Southern speaking children. So the influence wasn't there for me in the same way it is for children of native speakers. But what I think you realize when you're talking to people in the South is that Southern identity means something to them. Yes. But when you have a lot of immigration and you're talking to a lot of people that are not from your area and you're on Zoom or whatever kinds of internet access you have now, your connections might be loosened or weakened with the people at home because they're stronger with people outside your area. And that also will atrophy dialect differences. But if you go to rural areas of the South, you still see really strong differences in dialect. So I don't think it's true that we're losing them entirely, but urban centers have become much more homogenous over the last several decades. And that is really where we see the weakening of regional dialect boundaries.
For me, it's the loss in your descriptor of the ecosystem that we lose a species when we lose a language. One of those deadish languages is Yiddish. And so much of our comedy, I believe, is directly related to that. Mel Brooks has been opining and actually grieving the loss of the word schmuck. and its replacement, douche. That is the new schmuck. And he says, I don't want to live in a world without schmuck. Schmuck has certain implications. And it kind of goes with that Maya Angelou idea of you don't know where you're going if you don't know where you're from. And I think language has so much to do with where you're from. What do we lose when Yiddish is gone from the vernacular and replaced by a more common urban-centered douche? We lose something.
I think a lot of it is just this idea that where we're from is not just a place, it's also an identity.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work in linguistics on place-based meaning, and it has a lot more than just, it's not geographic, it's social. And at every place, we are not just one thing, we're many things in that place. So I can be from the South, but I can also be Black from the South. And that's going to be a very different social identity experience than someone who's white from the South. You might share some linguistic features, but how that plays out for you in terms of what it represents might be very, very different. So this is where we see something like y'all, which is a great word, and it meets a need that we have in English for a second person plural that actually is plural. Y'all is the way that we went from you, singular, you, plural, to be able to say a group versus just a single person. But it also exemplifies a joie de vivre, so to speak, a connection, a emotional kind of feeling about the place you live in, that you're all connected in some way, that made it so attractive that it became not just a Southern feature, but if you follow African-American migration outside of the South, it came with them and became a marker of identity that's no longer Southern, but also is sort of African-American community, right? So these words, these sounds, these expressions we have are not just about place, they're about identity. And I think when we lose them, we lose that identity. We become something different. We change to a different identity, but sometimes that identity is something much more formal and rigid, and that doesn't meet the need we have for connection and emotion and solidarity. And that's, I think, the crux of these social dialects is they represent who we are at a very fundamental emotional level.
Oh my God, Valerie, I'm serious. If our families went on vacation together, I just would not stop talking with you. I'm so blown away. And I've got so many other questions. One of them is related to alexithymia. Alexithymia, for those who are listening who don't know what it means the inability to connect our emotions with words or our words to emotions. And just the mere saying of something, as you said, when I learned the word Natsukashi, I was able to increase my emotional intelligence right on the spot and say something that I couldn't name. It's almost like I gave a name to pink when pink didn't exist in my mind previously. And now I know the feeling of Natsukashi. And I think having the vernacular, being able to use words to describe feelings in particular, but other experiences is so important. And the idea of a migrating regional language, you're blowing my mind. Yeah, that's incredible. And that how something is lost. And then, of course, the need to code switch as we perceive it, the need to speak the language of the masses. And then when we go back to our group, we're able to kind of engage in a way that we couldn't with the larger group. Let's talk a bit about code switching, the good, bad, and the ugly about it. I know I do it, and it doesn't take very long. If I go to Hawaii, I can't help it. I start kind of unwittingly, not mimicking, but I
pick it up.
The local, it's like there's this little pidgin language that emerges from me, and a slowing from it takes about 3 days, but 3 days in, I'm changed for the moment. I'm still California Adam, but I do find myself unwittingly code switching when I'm not meaning to. But let's talk about that.
Okay. Well, first, let's sort of think about code switching just because it's a big word that's been looked at very different ways. And so there are two different ways we can talk about code switching. The more traditional idea of code switching is when you have two languages that you're very adept at, and you go back and forth in the same, even sometimes sentence or conversation between those two systems in ways that are locally meaningful. So I might be talking to someone who also has those two languages. And just as you were talking about how certain languages have words for things that meet that idea or that emotion better, a lot of times when you're switching between two languages, it's because either you learned that emotion or experienced it, that thing, when you had one language or in that language. And so it makes sense to you to explain it in that language, if that makes sense. So,
100%.
say that you are talking about Mexican street corn, let's say, And obviously, if you speak Spanish and you're from Mexico, it would make more sense to describe your first experience with Mexican street corn in that language and using the native language for it, because that's what it is. And that was your experience as a child. It was in Spanish and your thinking was in Spanish. So you might be talking about that and then switch to English and say, oh yeah, my mom makes it all the time, because that's in present day in your English speaking setting. So that you went from an experience you described in Spanish because that was your childhood experience with it, to then switching to the English that represent your present day conversation, right? So this is one form of code switching. And it's really amazing that people can do it so adeptly. And it really does seem to track along either words that are better expressed in one language or experiences that happened in one language that are better described that way when two people speak the same language. The other type of code switching, which is what I think you were talking about, is where we vary stylistically in one language. And we really call that sort of stylistic switching, where you go between one end of your continuum of what resources and formality and types of markers you might have in your speech to the other end, which is usually more casual and informal, where you use a different set of features. So that might be something like when I say walking, when I'm giving a lecture or a talk, I was walking and talking, but when I'm hanging out with my friends, I was walking and talking. So you see how that one word, walking and talking, I have one feature different between them, but it gives a whole other sense to the emotion of what I'm experiencing and our connection. And that's sort of the code switching I think you're talking about. And the beauty of language is we all have what's called stylistic repertoire, which means we can choose from these different features. And it's somewhat automatic, context and the person we're talking to. So I might talk to my family members using one end, a more casual, unless I'm mad at them, a more casual mode. And then when I go talk to my chair or my dean, and it's a more high stakes, formal, standard sort of place, I will switch to the more standard end of my continuum.
100%.
We all have that access. What differs between us is what the ends are, what the endpoints of our stylistic continuum are, and what dialect we're using. So a lot of people get upset because they think they're not speaking standard English. But even speakers that speak a non-standard dialect have a repertoire, and they shift in that repertoire the same way we do when we're standard English speakers to use a formal and less formal variant. It's just the endpoints are different and the dialect is different. So it's something we all do as humans, and we do it for connection and also to impress people. So we're at the high end of our continuum when we're in high stakes employment or educational situations, for example. But in most of our daily life, we're at the lower end where we're actually trying to make connections and express solidarity and emotion and kindness and all those, or hate. All sorts of emotion is voiced in the low end of our continuum.
That's incredible to me, everything you've just dropped. Let's talk about acquiring a second language and why it's so damn hard. Why is it so hard to learn another language?
Well, that's a great question. I'm actually in the middle of writing a second book for a general audience, I should say, and it's on accents and why we have them and what they mean and what they do for us. And I'm in the middle of the chapter that it pretty much is talking about the foundations for accent, the foundations for learning a second language, which are laid in infancy. So when we're babies, we are already attending to sound. So even in the womb, we find that children are sort of more lulled by their mother's voice and their mother's accent than other accents external to the womb. So they already start to get a sense of the rhythm of their language, is what we think, from the sound of their mother's voice when they're in the womb. Then they come out and you think they're just laying there pooping and eating, which is definitely something they do, having survived the infancy of
Not mutually
children.
exclusive. It is happening.
But while they're doing this stuff, the reason they don't have time to go find a bathroom is because they're actually doing the hard work of learning the sounds of their language. So a baby is born like a blank box, but not really blank. They have stuff in there to tune into the sounds of language, but they can learn the sounds of any language. So there's about 800 speech sounds in human language that are possible.
Wait, hang on a second. I need to process that for a second. 800 speech sounds?
Yes. If you look across the world languages, about all the speech sounds that are possible to make, there are about 800 total, but languages only choose around 30-ish of those. So every language picks from those. And generally out of the 800 possible, we end up with about 20 to 37 or 38. English has about 39, so we're on the high end.
Really? So when like the katakana and hiragana in Japanese, it's a, i, u, e, o, kakiku, heko. There's about 66 in each. And we only have 30-ish.
Yes. Well, I think sometimes when you look at the way that spelling works and sort of how a language writes their letters, it's a very different thing than the actual sounds that we say, and you might be doing slightly different things. I don't think the inventory of Japanese is 66. I think it's smaller than that, actual phonemes, and that's just a combinatory practice. In English, if you actually count up our alphabet, we don't have as many sounds in the alphabet that are written as the sounds that we actually make. English has about 39 sounds, and you have 26 letters in the alphabet. So obviously there's a problem there. So we have to not think about writing. Yeah, we have to not get focused on writing. Writing came after language, not before. So writing actually doesn't define language, doesn't define spoken language. Spoken language helped define written language. But because we tend not to be linguists, we didn't know how to write it down correctly. And therefore, we don't actually represent all the sounds we make. Each language makes many more sounds than speakers of that language think they make. That can be a whole lecture on its own. But essentially, a great example is in Japanese, there R and L distinction. It doesn't exist. Well, that's not because Japanese speakers don't make it. Just if you looked at the speech sounds that come out of a Japanese speaker's mouth, that they don't make L-like sounds and R-like sounds, they do. But for a Japanese speaker, their mental categorization of those sounds is that they're the same sound. So the L and the flap, which is sort of the thing that we think of as R for a Japanese speaker, is actually just an L, right? They don't have a separate R and a separate L as two sounds like we do in English. Same thing if you look at English L, we actually have different L's. So say the word lull, L-U-L-L. If you say that word, lull, you notice that the L at the start is different than the L at the end.
It doesn't lull. At the end, it lulls.
One is an alveolar L, the other is a velar L. They're actually made differently. They're different sounds. For a speaker of a different language, they might actually be completely different, just like L and R are in English. But for an English speaker, we produce them because of where they are in the word. But we don't actually understand that we produce them. Most people just think they make an L. It's not till you study linguistics, you're like, wow, look at that. I make two different L's. Who knew? So sounds are a complex thing. But in terms of the sounds that a speaker of any language thinks they make, it usually is between about 20 and 37. That's usually how many sounds a language selects, if you want to personify it for that language. So a baby has the ability to make 800 sounds, but they have to whittle those down to the 37 or whatever that their language uses. And they're doing all that within the first 9 to 12 months of life, which can you imagine how hard that is, right? No one's teaching them. You don't go and say, okay, honey, here we're doing the alphabet, right? I know you're only 2 months old, but listen up, right? You don't do that as a parent.
This is how this language works.
Right. The only thing you do as a parent is you model the sounds for them, but you don't even do it well because rarely do you go, ba, ha, ka, right? You don't do that to your kids. You speak in full sentences. And if you think about a full sentence, it is sounds run together, right? All of the sounds are running together. When you run a sound together, they start to take on each other's qualities. So a great example is the T in the word like tot versus a T in the word like trot. If you look at my lips, tot, tr, ta, tr, you can see my lips are rounded for the T and trot, but not for the T and tot. So a child is actually hearing a regular T versus what's called a retroflex T in those two cases. Now, if you are a Hindi speaking baby, if you're going to be speaking Hindi, or a language called Hindi or Urdu, that language actually makes a difference between those two sounds. So ta and tr are two different sounds. English does not. So a baby who gets no help from their parents is having to figure that out within that first year of life. So it is amazing how much work they're doing mentally trying to figure out language. And that's why they can't go to the toilet to pee and poop, because they're too busy with language. So what happens is by the time you're 2 or 3 to 5 months, you are experimenting with all sorts of sounds. Your mouth is trying to make just human language sounds, all the ones in your brain. You're just trying to do them, but they're not language specific yet. You're just making sounds. And that's why babies make a lot of sounds that we don't necessarily recognize as sounds of our language, because they're experimenting with sounds of other languages too. By the time they hit 12 months, they're only babbling in the sounds of their language, which means they have gone from 0 to 100 in 12 months, where they figured out the sounds of their language all on their own, basically, just by hearing the input of parent speech.
That is
It's crazy. So what happens, though, is as they're doing that, they're also teaching their muscles to make those sounds of their language. They're teaching their muscles to do it in exactly the way that native speakers of their language make it. So then they're starting to atrophy the sounds that they can make because now they're not needing them. They go away in their brain. They're not even thinking them anymore. They start to only think in the sounds of their language, and they start to only do the muscle memory for the sounds of their language. By the time that kid is 12, they no longer can think the other sounds, and they no longer can say the other sounds because now their muscular structure is habituated to the sounds of their language, and their brain has basically pruned out the other sounds so that now they're only thinking in their sounds and they're only speaking in their sounds, which means here comes another language when you're 15 or 16 in high school, which is when a lot of kids start learning a second language.
Right.
And voila, now you're just learning it like you learn math, just like a high skill that you have to learn and memorize. Whereas if you learn that language as a 2 or 3-year-old, your brain would be able to then keep those sounds in its little brain center that it originated with, and also teach your muscles to make that sound. And so you would come out native-like. But after about 12, it's much harder for our mouths to learn to form in different ways to make those new sounds, and also to learn the patterns of those new sounds, which often conflict in direct opposition to the way we use them in English. So like in Hindi, I have a retroflex T and a regular T that actually make words different in meaning. But in English, it's patterned by where it occurs. So then I have to unlearn that in English to learn it in Hindi. So then it becomes really difficult to not only just memorize all this new stuff, but also then to train myself out of what I had learned from my first language. And that is really the fundamental root of why accents get established and second languages are hard to learn as adults.
So interesting. And you're talking about pruning in a way I've never really thought about it in terms of the cost of primary language acquisition, if not attended to before the age of 12. And I'm thinking about kids who've been raised in bilingual homes. I have a friend who raised her child with English and French, and both of her children learned how to speak Spanish very easily compared to, I believe, other people that you're nodding.
Right. And I think what we do find with bilingual brains is they do tend to process things better. It's, you're using more of your brain in various ways because you've kept alive more options. And Spanish and French are also much more closely related than Spanish and English, right? Because English is Germanic. And even though we have borrowed a lot of Romance stuff in over the years, it's actually a Germanic structure, whereas French is a Romance language like Spanish. So that would make it easier to learn too, because they're more similar. So they have rules that are more similar overall. But yes, when you keep your brain more active by learning two systems, you do yourself a solid for years to come. There's a lot of evidence that bilingual brains tend to be more effective than non-bilingual brains. Not insulting those of us that are monolingual, but it is a good thing to have more than one language, not a bad thing.
Wow, that's absolutely incredible. Pruning is a thing. Our brains are meant to be efficient. They're meant to conserve energy. And the idea that we would whittle down from the 800 sounds to the relevant sounds of our language, that makes a lot of sense. It comes at a huge loss. And yet it sounds like kind of like cognitive biases and a host of other things that keep us alive, but maybe cause us to think less well.
I think about the invention of locomotion. Obviously, there were great benefits. It changed the world, the rise of locomotion and trains and things like that. But we also tend to lose something. We've created pollution and damaged our ecosystem through it. And we've also stopped looking at the things around us in the way that we did before. So there's always costs to movement forward and to decisions that we make. But in language, it's a really good one most of the time. When we settle on one system, it really helps us achieve that system more economically, more efficiently, more productively. But we are very, very able to handle multiple systems at the same time. When I said there are 800 sounds in world languages, those are the ones that babies have learned. What we probably are born with is the capacity to make all of those sounds, not the knowledge of them, if that makes sense. The knowledge of them comes from the exposure that we get.
Brilliant. And we're thinking a lot about AI and its implications. And you're basically saying throughout history, whether it's locomotion or perhaps even the invention of the wheel, like, gosh, life was so much better before the invention of the wheel. We could take more time to talk and look at things and build relationships as we struggled. Who knows what it was back then? But that is a really good point in how language changes with technology, including the lexicon to reflect that new technology. We didn't have a word for the internet 70 years ago. And now that's one of the most common phrases. Before we go, let's get into how a grammarian who was perhaps not a Gen Z or a millennial who might be more facile with acquiring the word they and the implications of it. Maybe somebody from, let's say, Gen X or before is listening to the word they and thinking about it almost like in the conjugation of verbs. It's very hard to assimilate that if you are just trying to take it on as a new feature. What are your tips so that people can honor the word they and maybe have less cognitive dissonance as they do so? You really create a good case in the book, and I would love for you to share that.
Sure. Well, there is a lot of really interesting research on singular they and how people process it, and also how it affects how they process the world. And the big dividing line with singular they seems to be between the millennial generation and those born after, and then those born before that. And for those born before that, singular they wasn't really a thing in this non-binary sense. It was absolutely a thing in the unisex sense. So singular they used as an epicene pronoun, which is a big word for non-gendered pronoun. Like if anybody wants to do that, they should go see the teacher.
That's right.
That kind of epicene use, that has been around for 700 years. So we all do it, and we didn't even realize we did it. It wasn't a thing, right? So generally, we don't find that being so different between those age groups. What's really different is the non-binary use, which has only been around for about 20 years or so in mainstream use. So I think what happens is when you weren't born with it and it wasn't part of your experience growing up, not just that you didn't have a word for it, but you probably didn't have a way of thinking about it because you didn't have the language for it. I mean, that's sort of part of the thing. Singular they as a non-binary pronoun has changed fundamentally the way we think about binary gender. And so when you're born into a world where that's a discussion and that's a use, it just becomes natural of part of that world. So you don't then hear a pronoun and instantly connect a gender to it. So when you hear they, it doesn't need to be gendered. There's no marking of gender with that pronoun. But for people of my age group and older, they was used in epicene use, but not in a non-binary way. So we still tend to think in gender with names. So if I have a name like Sally or Dave, for my age group, a lot of times you'll find that people think of those as certain types of gendered names. So they don't think in a non-binary way. They think in a binary gendered way, which makes it hard then when they is used with those names, because it's in the brain, a disconnect between the gender I have marked for that name and the non-binary use of they, which then I struggle, right? Then I'm having to think about it and it feels awkward to me. But if I'm young enough that I tend to be more willing to accept the non-binariness of the world, and I may not mark names then with binary properties, hearing a they use doesn't cause that actual syntactic disconnect. And what we find when we study these age groups is that's exactly what we find with processing. Older speakers have more problems processing singular they than younger speakers, which doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means you need practice doing it. And so if you spend time using they in a non-binary way, what you find is people get better at it. It is one of those cases where practice does maybe not make perfect, but make better. Whereas young people don't have a problem with it. And so it's rare in the early Gen Z, Gen Alpha. I don't think that's going to even be a problem with them. And by that time, non-binary they will be such a thing, it's not even going to be talked about anymore.
For sure.
It's just that we still remember a different time and a different coding of our syntactic properties, and that's problematic for us.
So any just easy takeaway advice for somebody who's trying to linguistically implement that the word they as singular?
Well, one thing is I think a lot of people struggle with the verb that goes with it. So, the they is, they are, we think of singular verbs as is, but plural verbs would be are. So it would be they are. And one great model is the singular and plural use of you. Historically, you was only a plural pronoun. It was not a singular pronoun.
As
so
ye
was subject, you was object, and they were both only plural. Thou and thee were the singular forms of you. So it would be thou for a singular, ye for a plural, thee for an object case singular, and you for an object case plural. So as you can tell, you now has taken over all those categories, and we've just gotten rid of those, simplified them. It's all you all the time now. So that's a pretty big thing we did, right? In the 16th century, that was complete. And no one seems to care about that anymore. And when you're talking about a singular you don't say you is doing that. I mean, there are some dialects that do, and it makes sense because they have actually just adjusted one step further. But most standard English speakers will say, you are going to go, right? when they're talking to one person or they're talking to two. So they're still using the plural verb with what was a plural pronoun that's now used in singular sense. That's exactly the model that we're doing with they. We take a formerly plural pronoun, we're putting it in a singular use, but primarily keeping a plural verb with it. So that feels better to people that are sort of prescriptively trained to use they with a plural verb. So it's generally what happens. It's generally the model that people follow. They'll say they are going John, meaning John, a singular referent. So you use the plural verb. And so don't worry about trying to fix it with a singular verb, because that's often where people have this grammatical clash that just doesn't feel right. Go ahead and use that plural verb. That's absolutely where things are going and the perfectly appropriate thing to do.
That's fantastic. And really just one of the things that I love about your book is you provide so much historical precedent and you give us context. And you say they has been used for 600, if it's
about 1300s, actually.
1300, so even,
we find Chaucer using singular they as an epicene pronoun.
That's right. And you mentioned Canterbury Tales. That's right. That's totally fascinating. If you say that your kids have some difficulty having a mom as a linguist, I think they're the luckiest people in the world, and I want you to tell them. My son has reflected to me that he can tell who I'm talking to on the phone based on the way I'm talking quite often. Just they're nonverbal cues within my language that indicate to him a thing. And I've read somewhere, and I want to have it corroborated or negated by you, that we actually change our tone, our whole host of features, depending on, you actually do reference this in the book somewhat, that we change. And I'm wondering, do we change for literally every person with whom we're speaking?
No, we don't. We're not that flexible. I mean, It would be great. And that would also be a lot of work. But remember that stylistic repertoire I was talking about? What we do is we kind of know where on that repertoire we should aim for, depending on who we're talking to. And a lot of times it's groups that we're talking to. So friends, we'll talk to all our friends in a similar manner. We'll talk to our parents in a certain way. We'll talk to our boss in a certain way, or people at work, corporate types. They would all get that same sort of chat, same style of talk. That said, sometimes we have certain habits we develop with people we're very intimate with. So if we are talking to our spouse, a lot of times we have kind of I'd like to call it a love language or a marriage language or a couple language that we have developed. Things we say, it might be words that we tend to use that are in-group words. It might be sort of a cuddly type talk. We might baby talk each other. Those are usually more person-specific. And so we don't change our language specifically to each person, except for people that we spend a lot of time with, or we have some sort of habitual interaction with that has defined our language. So I have two really close girlfriends from college that I'm still close with. And my kids can tell when I'm talking to them because we revert to a certain kind of conversation and style that we had when we were in college that I don't use with anybody I talk to in my modern lifetime. So yes, absolutely. There are certain specific clues, and it can be words that you use. It can be intonation patterns you can adopt, and it can be sort of more holistic style that you take on. But the really specific ones tend to be limited to certain people that you have a past with that has developed a certain way of talking.
Absolutely brilliant. I remember when I was in junior high school, my mom's childhood friends from Newark, New Jersey came over, and she was using terms I'd never heard her use ever before. And I found it actually appalling. I didn't know what to say. And afterwards I said, Mom, what were you saying? Isn't that a stitch? Is a term she used. I guess it was big in the 50s with Arthur Fonzarelli back in his diner. I can't imagine she never used that term. So yes, with my childhood friends, that must be something I'm giving away. Is there anything I should have asked before I ask my final question?
I think you covered it. I mean, there's so many things to talk about. I think you did great.
Okay, fantastic. Seriously, I already want to interview you on your next book. If you're down.
It's going to be a couple of years. I'm just in the I've only written a couple of chapters, so it's going to be probably at least a year and a half. But
I totally get it. I just shipped at 12:36 a.m. yesterday morning. I shipped my manuscript to my publisher finally, and it.
Oh, congratulations!
Thank you. It felt like I was Frodo throwing the ring in the fires of Mordor. I don't know about you, but it feels like a baby that just cannot stop crying to be fed a book. It's so awful and so wonderful. Is.
And it's still, yes, it's forever. You'll want to keep tweaking. And you'll have your chance. You'll still, between manuscript and book
because I've already thought of wait. So here's my final and magical question I ask everybody. I want to hear your way. If you had the magical abilities to confer upon all humanity one skill or insight that would vastly improve the lives of the individual, and perhaps, since we know we have a ripple effect, the people around us, what would that skill or insight be, and how do you imagine it would impact people?
I think that really exactly why I wrote the book is because the one skill I wanted to give people was to get out of the prescriptive view as being the only view for language and understand language as a science. So if I can give one skill to people, it would be, I'd like to endow them with a fundamental linguistic knowledge so that they understood things like phonemes, which are sounds of language, and syntactic structures, and how they operate in the brain and in the mouth, because that would really give people empathy. And I think what we lack a lot, and not just language and how we hear other people linguistically, but in the world today, is we lack empathy for understanding that people come to be speaking the way they speak or thinking the way they think through the experiences they have lived. And I might not be able to understand you because I haven't lived the life you've lived and I haven't adopted the linguistic habits that you've adopted. But that's not your problem. That's our problem to solve together. And so if we could do it with empathy, I think that would make a big difference in a lot of the conversations that we have.
Serious mic drop. That is fantastic. If my podcast was Family Feud, it would be like, that would be the number one answer. Empathy, quickly followed by self-compassion. The way you couched it was so different through the lens of a linguist was just great. I just can't thank you enough, Valerie.
Oh,
this is so much fun to talk with you and to geek out to language with you and its implications, its history, how we can think about things perhaps more cognitively flexibly. If there's any goal of this podcast, it's to increase flexible thinking. You have made a massive contribution to us thinking more flexibly.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate you saying that.
This is Dr. Adam Dorsey thanking you for listening to Super Psyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe